$750 a week. That's what my dignity was worth to him. The Admiral leaned in during inspection, the whole deck silent, brass polished, cameras flashing, and whispered, "Prove you're worth it," in my bed. He thought I'd freeze, like every woman he'd cornered before. But I didn't freeze. I recorded. 24 hours later, his phone buzzed, "Report to Internal Affairs." And when he walked in, the only sound in that room was his own voice playing back. Before I tell you how I turned fear into evidence and silence into justice, like this video, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Because power only wins when we stay quiet, and I did not. You want to know what pride looks like? It's a fresh-pressed uniform at 0500, boots that reflect the morning sun, and a salute so crisp it could cut glass. That was me, Navy intelligence analyst, 3 years of spotless service, every stripe earned through blood, sweat, and the kind of discipline that turns ordinary people into something extraordinary. I believed in the chain of command like other people believe in God, absolute, unwavering, sacred. They called him the Eagle. Admiral Marcus Thornton, a man whose presence could silence a room full of seasoned officers with nothing but a glance. 30 years of service, chest decorated like a Christmas tree, a legend who could break recruits before his morning coffee got cold. When you heard his voice echo through the corridors, grown men straightened their spines and held their breath. He was the Navy embodied, untouchable, revered. The transfer came through on a Tuesday. "Congratulations," my commanding officer said, barely looking up from his paperwork. "You've been reassigned to Admiral Thornton's Intelligence Division. Consider it recognition of your outstanding performance." I felt my chest swell with pride. 3 years of 12-hour days, perfect evaluations, never missing a deadline, it was all leading to this moment. A promotion. A chance to work directly under one of the Navy's most respected leaders. I should have known better. In the military, when something seems too good to be true, it usually is. The first red flag should have been the meeting schedule. "Admiral prefers one-on-one briefings," his aide explained. "More efficient." The second should have been the way his eyes lingered during our initial introduction, not on my face, not on my ribbons, but somewhere that made my skin crawl. The third should have been how his compliments always carried an undertone that had nothing to do with my intelligence reports. "Outstanding work on the Middle East analysis," he'd say, standing just a little too close. "You have such dedication." The way he said that word, dedication, made it sound dirty, like he was tasting something forbidden. But I was a good soldier. I followed protocol. I respected rank. I told myself I was imagining things because that's what you do when your brain tries to protect you from a truth you're not ready to face. The crossing happened on a Thursday morning during routine inspection. The entire intelligence unit stood at attention, back straight, eyes forward, the kind of military precision that would make a drill sergeant weep with joy. Admiral Thornton moved down the line like a predator examining prey, stopping occasionally to adjust a collar or comment on presentation. When he reached me, time slowed to a crawl. He circled me like a shark, his breath hot against my ear as he leaned in close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with something else, something that reeked of entitlement and corruption. The entire room watched, but pretended not to see, eyes fixed straight ahead in that peculiar military blindness that develops when witnessing something you know you can't stop. "You want to keep your job?" he whispered, his voice barely audible but cutting through my soul like a rusty knife. "Then prove you're worth it." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of vacuum that sucks the air from your lungs and leaves you gasping. Every person in that room heard him. Every single one. But military discipline is a powerful thing, and sometimes it protects the wrong people. I swallowed both rage and fear, tasted bile in my throat, and gave him exactly what protocol demanded: a sharp salute and a crisp, "Yes, sir." Inside, something died. Something fundamental and pure that I'd carried since the day I first put on this uniform. The Navy taught me how to follow orders. but no one prepared me for when the orders rot from the inside out. That night, I stared at my reflection in the mirror and saw a stranger wearing my face. The woman looking back at me had hollow eyes and trembling hands that couldn't steady themselves no matter how hard I tried. I'd spent 3 years building a reputation based on integrity, intelligence, and unwavering dedication to service. In one whispered sentence, he'd reduced me to nothing more than a commodity, something to be bought, sold, and used. The next morning, I walked into my superior's office with my spine straight and my report typed in perfect military format. Captain Rodriguez looked up from his desk with the kind of expression that told me he already knew why I was there. In the military, bad news travels at the speed of light while good news gets lost in paperwork. Sir, I need to file a formal complaint regarding inappropriate conduct by Admiral Thornton, I began, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Rodriguez's face went cold, not surprised cold, but the kind of ice that forms when someone doesn't want to deal with uncomfortable truths. He's your commanding officer, he said without looking at me. I suggest you watch your tone and consider very carefully what you're implying. The dismissal hit me like a physical blow. Sir, with respect, I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. The Admiral made inappropriate advances that constitute sexual harassment under military regulation. Enough. The word came out like a gunshot. You're obviously under stress. Perhaps you need some time to reconsider your perspective on this situation. That was military speak for shut up and go away. I recognized the language because I'd been trained to use it myself. The art of saying no without actually saying no, of dismissing concerns without technically refusing to address them. The next day, I found myself transferred to a desk in the basement of Building C, a concrete tomb where military careers go to die. My security clearance was under review, which meant frozen indefinitely. My team was reassigned. My access to classified intelligence networks was revoked. Overnight, I went from rising star to administrative ghost, filing reports that nobody would ever read about supplies that nobody needed. The rumor mill started immediately. Insubordination, they whispered in the halls. Attitude problems. Couldn't handle the pressure. In the military, your reputation is everything, and mine was being systematically destroyed by people who'd never spoken a single word to me, but somehow knew my entire story. That's when I realized the most horrifying truth about institutional power: it doesn't have to prove you're guilty. It just has to make everyone believe you are. In this uniform, truth doesn't travel, it sinks. It gets buried under protocol and procedure, suffocated by bureaucracy and chain of command. The very system designed to protect justice becomes the weapon used to destroy it. But here's what Admiral Thornton didn't know about me, what none of them knew. I was my father's daughter, and my father was old-school NCIS. He taught me that preparation isn't just about being ready for what you expect, it's about being ready for what you never saw coming. That morning, the morning of the inspection, I'd slipped a digital recorder into my breast pocket. Not because I was planning anything, but because something in my gut told me to document everything. Military intelligence teaches you to trust your instincts, and my instincts were screaming. When I played back that recording in my quarters that night, my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the device. But there it was, crystal clear, undeniable evidence. His voice, his words, his corruption captured in digital perfection. For the first time since that morning, I smiled. The moment of power flipped like a switch. Every whispered word, every calculated pause, every breath between his threats, it was all there, preserved forever in ones and zeros. Technology had done what the chain of command couldn't or wouldn't do. It had created accountability. My heartbeat synchronized with the playback as I listened to it again and again, memorizing every inflection, every casual cruelty in his voice. This was my evidence. This was my ammunition. This was my chance to turn the tables on a system that had tried to crush me into silence. But I knew better than to march straight into internal affairs with my smoking gun. I'd already learned that lesson the hard way with Captain Rodriguez. The military justice system had its own rules, its own language, its own way of protecting itself from uncomfortable truths. If I wanted justice, I'd have to speak that language fluently. Internal Affairs wouldn't take my claim without proper chain of command authorization. Fine. I'd give them a chain strong enough to strangle corruption itself. I encrypted the file with military-grade security protocols, created multiple backup copies stored in different locations, and sent it through an anonymous whistleblower channel that couldn't be traced back to me directly. The file was labeled simply, Evidence of Sexual Harassment by Admiral Marcus Thornton, USN. No emotion, no editorializing, just facts presented with the kind of clinical precision that intelligence reports demand. The upload bar crawled across my screen at an agonizing pace, each percentage point representing another second closer to either justice or professional suicide. There was no middle ground here. Either this recording would destroy Admiral Thornton's career, or it would destroy mine. But I'd already accepted that my career might be over the moment I refused to be his victim. When the upload completed, I closed my laptop and sat in the darkness of my quarters, listening to the distant sound of ships moving in the harbor. Somewhere out there in the night, other women were facing the same choice I'd faced: submit or resist, comply or fight back, stay silent or speak truth to power. I'd made my choice. Now I had to wait for the consequences. The next 24 hours passed like a slow-motion explosion. I watched Admiral Thornton from a distance as he moved through his daily routine, morning briefings with senior staff, lunch with Pentagon officials, an afternoon press conference about new naval initiatives. He stood at that podium with his chest full of ribbons, speaking about honor and duty and service to country, while my recording sat in an internal affairs inbox like a ticking time bomb. That evening, I methodically packed my personal items from my locker, assuming this might be my last night on base as anything other than a defendant. I folded my uniforms with the same precision I'd learned in boot camp, creasing each seam perfectly, honoring the uniform even as I prepared to potentially lose the right to wear it. My laptop sat open on my desk, the upload confirmation still glowing on the screen. One file, 47 seconds long, containing enough evidence to topple a man who'd spent 3 decades building his legend. The power of technology to preserve truth never ceased to amaze me, no matter how hard people try to deny what happened. Digital evidence doesn't forget, doesn't embellish, doesn't lie. The next morning at 0800 sharp, Admiral Thornton's phone buzzed during his morning staff meeting. I wasn't there to see it happen, but I heard about it later from his aide, a young ensign who looked like he'd seen a ghost. Report to Internal Affairs immediately, the text message read. Nothing more, nothing less. In military communication, brevity usually indicates either routine business or serious trouble. Given the source, this definitely wasn't routine. He walked into that Internal Affairs office with the same swagger he'd carried for 30 years, expecting another administrative formality or minor personnel issue. His posture was perfect, his uniform immaculate, his expression conveying the kind of confidence that comes from never facing real consequences for your actions. Then he saw me sitting at the conference table, and his face changed. Not dramatically. Men like Admiral Thornton are too controlled for obvious displays of emotion, but I caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw that suggested he was beginning to understand this wasn't a routine meeting. The Internal Affairs investigator, Commander Sarah Walsh, gestured for him to take a seat across from me. Walsh was a by-the-book officer with 20 years of experience investigating military misconduct, the kind of person who'd seen every excuse, heard every denial, and learned to read the subtle signs that separate truth from fiction. Admiral Thornton, Walsh began, her voice professionally neutral, we've received allegations of sexual harassment that require immediate investigation. Before we proceed, I want to make sure you understand your rights in this proceeding. I watched his face as she spoke, cataloging every micro-expression, every tell that revealed his internal calculation. He was running scenarios, trying to figure out what I might have said, what I might have done, how much evidence I might possess. Then Walsh pressed play on the digital recorder connected to the room's speaker system. The first sound was ambient noise, the rustle of uniforms, the shuffling of boots, the low murmur of officers preparing for inspection. Then came his voice, clear and unmistakable, cutting through the background noise like a blade. "You want to keep your job? Then prove you're worth it." The silence that followed was different from the silence in the inspection room. This was the silence of accountability, of truth confronting power, of consequences finally arriving at the door of someone who thought himself untouchable. His face went through a series of changes. Surprise, recognition, calculation, and finally a kind of pale understanding that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. That was the first time I saw a man in power meet the sound of his own corruption, and it was both terrifying and beautiful. "Admiral," Walsh continued, "do you recognize your own voice in this recording?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Everyone in that room knew the answer, but protocol demanded that he respond, that he own his words or attempt to deny the undeniable. He started, then stopped. For 30 years, Admiral Thornton had commanded rooms full of people, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Now, faced with his own recorded words, he seemed to have forgotten how to speak. "Sir," Walsh prompted, "I need you to answer the question. Is that your voice on the recording?" "Yes," he said finally, the word coming out like a confession torn from his chest. "But the context." "We'll discuss context," Walsh interrupted. "But first, I need to inform you that this investigation will be conducted according to Military Regulation 15-6, and you have the right to legal representation." That's when I knew we'd won. Not the case. That would take weeks of investigation, testimony, and legal maneuvering. But the war for truth, the battle against silence, the fight for accountability, that victory was sealed the moment his own voice betrayed him. The recording played 3 more times during that initial interview, each playback driving the reality deeper into his consciousness. This wasn't going away. This wasn't something he could smooth over with his connections or bury under bureaucratic procedure. Digital evidence doesn't care about rank or reputation. It just preserves truth with relentless objectivity. As I walked out of that internal affairs office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not naive optimism, but the hard-earned hope that comes from turning pain into power, from transforming victimhood into agency, from proving that even the most entrenched systems can be forced to confront their own failures. But hope, I was about to learn, is a dangerous thing in the military. Because systems don't surrender easily, and powerful men don't go down without a fight. The Navy's response came swift and brutal, like a coordinated military operation designed to destroy an enemy target. Except in this case, I was the target, and the enemy was the very institution I'd sworn to serve. Within 72 hours of that internal affairs meeting, my entire world turned upside down. The investigation that should have focused on Admiral Thornton's conduct suddenly developed a secondary target: me. Specifically, my conduct unbecoming an officer for recording a superior without consent. Improper recording procedures, the new charges read. Violation of privacy regulations. Potential breach of security protocols. Evidence of emotional instability affecting judgment. It was a masterclass in institutional self-preservation. When you can't attack the evidence, attack the person who produced it. When you can't deny the corruption, criminalize the exposure of it. When you can't win on facts, change the battlefield to character assassination and procedural violations. Captain Rodriguez, who dismissed my initial complaint, was suddenly very interested in speaking with me. "This recording stunt," he said during our forced meeting, "shows a troubling pattern of insubordination and poor judgment. We're concerned about your fitness for duty." The irony was suffocating. Admiral Thornton sexually harassed me, and I was the one with fitness concerns. He violated every principle of military leadership, and I was the one facing character assassination. The system had inverted reality so completely that the victim had become the villain and the perpetrator had become the aggrieved party. Internal affairs went dark after that initial interview. The case was under review, which is military speak for "we're hoping this goes away if we ignore it long enough." Commander Walsh stopped returning my calls. The timeline for investigation became indefinite. My security clearance remained frozen, my career effectively suspended while they decided whether to prosecute me for the crime of preserving evidence of a crime. Even my friends began keeping their distance. Not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. In the military, guilt by association is a real phenomenon, and nobody wanted to be seen as supporting someone who might be branded as a troublemaker or security risk. The isolation was almost worse than the harassment itself. At least Admiral Thornton's attack had been direct and identifiable. This was death by 1,000 cuts, each day bringing new forms of professional and social exile. I spent my evenings alone in my quarters, replaying conversations with colleagues who'd suddenly become too busy to grab coffee, too occupied to return messages, too concerned about their own careers to risk association with mine. The uniform I'd worn with such pride now felt like a target, marking me as damaged goods in a culture that values conformity above almost everything else. But isolation has a way of clarifying things. When you're stripped of distractions and forced to confront reality without the buffer of social approval or institutional support, you discover what you're really made of. And what I discovered was rage, not the hot, destructive kind that burns out quickly, but the cold, sustained fury that comes from being betrayed by something you believed in with your whole heart. Late one night, as I sat in my quarters listening to ships move through the harbor, I found myself playing an old voicemail from my father. He'd left it 6 months earlier, just before his retirement from NCIS, and I'd saved it without really knowing why. "Remember, kiddo," his gravelly voice said through the phone speaker, "silence is not loyalty. Real loyalty means standing up when the institution you love is failing to live up to its own values. The uniform doesn't make you honorable, your actions while wearing it do." Those words hit me like a revelation. I'd been thinking about this all wrong. I wasn't fighting against the Navy, I was fighting for it. I wasn't destroying the institution, I was trying to save it from itself. The real disloyalty wasn't speaking out against corruption, it was staying silent while that corruption poisoned everything the uniform was supposed to represent. That's when I began my own investigation, using every skill I'd learned as an intelligence analyst. If the official channels were going to protect Admiral Thornton and prosecute me, then I'd bypass the official channels entirely. I started with personnel records, cross-referencing Admiral Thornton's duty assignments with unusual patterns in transfer requests, early retirements, and medical leaves. What I found made my blood run cold, a 20-year trail of women who'd served under his command and then mysteriously disappeared from naval service, their careers ending abruptly with vague explanations and sealed files. Sarah Mitchell, forced medical retirement after serving 6 months under Thornton's command. Jennifer Rodriguez, early discharge citing family obligations after reporting to staff. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Wells transferred to remote assignments and eventually resigned her commission after filing harassment complaints that were resolved administratively. The pattern was unmistakable and horrifying. This wasn't an isolated incident or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was systematic predation spanning 2 decades, enabled by a culture of silence and protected by institutional inertia. I compiled every piece of information I could find into a comprehensive file, using the same analytical techniques I'd employed on foreign intelligence targets. Dates, locations, patterns of behavior, corroborating evidence, everything presented with the clinical precision that makes intelligence reports impossible to dismiss or ignore. The digital dossier grew to over 300 pages, each one documenting another piece of evidence that Admiral Thornton had been using his position to exploit and silence women for his entire career. I called it Operation Clean Wake, a reference to the naval tradition of leaving clean water behind you, unmarked by the corruption of your passage. But having evidence and getting anyone to act on it were two different things. The official investigation remained stalled, my own career remained in limbo, and Admiral Thornton continued his duties as if nothing had happened. That's when I realized I needed to force the issue, create a situation where ignoring the evidence would be impossible. The opportunity came when I learned about a classified hearing scheduled to review Admiral Thornton's promotion to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The timing was perfect and horrifying. While I was being investigated for exposing his corruption, he was being considered for promotion to the highest levels of military leadership. I had one chance to present my evidence where it couldn't be buried or ignored, directly to the tribunal charged with evaluating his fitness for promotion. It was a desperate move that would either end his career or destroy mine completely, with no middle ground possible. The night before the hearing, I sat in my quarters with the complete Operation Clean Wake file loaded onto an encrypted flash drive. 300 pages of evidence, dozens of testimonies, 20 years of documented predation, all reduced to a small piece of plastic and metal that could either restore justice or end my naval career forever. I thought about all the women who'd suffered in silence, all the careers destroyed by his abuse of power, all the times the system had chosen protecting its reputation over protecting its people. This moment wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every woman who'd been told to stay quiet, every victim who'd been branded as a troublemaker, every person who'd discovered that speaking truth to power comes with consequences the powerful never have to face. The next morning, I put on my dress uniform with the same precision I'd learned in boot camp, every ribbon and decoration positioned exactly according to regulation. If I was going down, I'd go down looking like the professional I'd always been, wearing the uniform with the honor it was supposed to represent. The tribunal was scheduled to convene at 1000 hours in Conference Room Alpha, a secure facility normally used for classified briefings and sensitive military discussions. By 09:55, I was standing outside that room with the flash drive in my pocket and my father's words echoing in my mind, "Silence is not loyalty." I walked into that hearing room like I was walking into battle, because that's exactly what it was, a battle for truth, for justice, for the soul of an institution that had forgotten its own values. Admiral Thornton was seated at the witness table, his uniform perfect, his posture confident, his expression suggesting he considered this promotion a foregone conclusion. The tribunal consisted of 3 flag officers, each with decades of service and enough ribbons to start their own medal shop. They looked up as I entered, their faces showing various degrees of surprise, confusion, and annoyance at the interruption of their proceeding. "Ma'am," the presiding officer said, "this is a closed hearing." "I'm going to have to ask you to." "Sir," I interrupted, pulling the flash drive from my pocket, "I have evidence relevant to this promotion review that requires immediate consideration." Admiral Thornton's attorney, a sharp-faced commander who looked like he billed by the minute, immediately objected. "Sir, this is highly irregular. The witness list for this hearing was finalized weeks ago, and—" "Then object to the truth," I said, my voice cutting through his protest like a blade through silk. "Because that's what's on this drive, truth that this tribunal needs to hear before making any decisions about Admiral Thornton's fitness for promotion." The room went silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of ships in the harbor. The presiding officer looked at Admiral Thornton, then at me, then at the flash drive in my hand. I could see the calculation in his eyes. The desire to maintain order warring with the curiosity about what evidence could be so compelling that an officer would risk her career to present it. "Ma'am," he said finally, "you have 5 minutes to state your case. After that, this tribunal will decide whether your evidence warrants further consideration." I plugged the flash drive into the room's presentation system, my hands steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. The first file that appeared on the screen was my original recording of Admiral Thornton's harassment, the audio waveform displayed like a digital heartbeat across the monitor. "Gentlemen," I began, "what you're about to hear is the voice of the man you're considering for promotion to the Joint Chiefs of Staff." I pressed play, and Admiral Thornton's words filled the room with crystal clarity. "You want to keep your job? Then prove you're worth it." The silence that followed was different from any I'd experienced before. This wasn't the silence of embarrassment or discomfort. This was the silence of recognition, of understanding, of walls coming down and masks being removed. But I wasn't finished. The flash drive contained more than just my recording. Over the next 20 minutes, I presented evidence from 6 other women who'd come forward after learning about the investigation. Women who'd suffered in silence for years, believing they were alone, believing no one would listen, believing the system would protect their abuser over their testimony. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell's statement played through the speakers, her voice shaking but determined. "He told me my performance evaluation depended on my willingness to provide special services beyond my normal duties. When I refused, my fitness reports suddenly became negative, and I was forced into medical retirement." Commander Jennifer Rodriguez spoke next. He made it clear that reporting his behavior would be considered insubordination. The message was clear: submit or have your career destroyed. I chose early discharge rather than continue enduring his harassment. One by one, their voices filled that hearing room, each testimony adding another layer to the overwhelming evidence of systematic abuse. These weren't isolated incidents or misunderstandings. They were part of a deliberate pattern of exploitation that had been allowed to continue for 20 years. Admiral Thornton sat through it all with his face growing paler by the minute, his confident posture slowly dissolving into something approaching panic. His attorney kept trying to object, citing procedural irregularities and improper evidence presentation, but the tribunal was transfixed by the testimonies. When the final recording ended, the room fell silent again. The presiding officer looked at Admiral Thornton with an expression I'd never seen on a flag officer's face before, not anger exactly, but a kind of deep disappointment mixed with disgust. "Admiral Thornton," he said, "do you have any response to these allegations?" For the first time in his career, Admiral, the Eagle, Thornton seemed lost for words. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. The man who'd commanded rooms full of officers, who'd built his reputation on decisive leadership and unwavering confidence, was reduced to speechless confusion by the sound of his own victims' voices. "Sir," he finally managed, "these allegations they're taken out of context. These women, they're clearly coordinating their stories to what?" I interrupted, my voice carrying 20 years of suppressed anger. "To destroy the career of the man who destroyed theirs? To seek justice from the system that failed them? To prevent other women from suffering what they suffered?" His attorney placed a hand on his arm, clearly trying to prevent him from saying anything else that might incriminate him further. But the damage was already done. The recordings had spoken with a clarity that no legal maneuvering could obscure. The tribunal deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, their faces told the story before they spoke a single word. The presiding officer's voice was heavy with the weight of institutional failure and personal disappointment. "Admiral Marcus Thornton," he announced, "based on the evidence presented to this tribunal, we find credible allegations of sexual harassment, abuse of power, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Your promotion to the Joint Chiefs of Staff is hereby denied, and we're recommending immediate court-martial proceedings." The words hung in the air like Judgment Day pronouncements. Admiral Thornton's face went from pale to gray to something approaching green, as if he was physically ill from hearing his fate pronounced. His attorney was already whispering urgent advice about appeals and damage control, but we all knew it was over. 30 years of service, a chest full of medals, a reputation built on the suffering of the women he'd victimized, all of it crashing down in one moment of accountability. As I walked out of that hearing room, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that morning when he first whispered his threat in my ear, the presence of justice. Not complete justice, not perfect justice, but the kind of justice that comes when truth finally finds its voice and power finally meets its consequences. The court-martial proceedings took 6 months, during which Admiral Thornton's defense team employed every legal strategy imaginable to discredit the evidence and attack the victims. They claimed the recordings were fabricated, that the women had coordinated their stories, that I had manipulated vulnerable people into making false accusations for personal gain. But digital evidence doesn't lie, and trauma has its own unmistakable signature that can't be faked or manufactured. The military prosecutors presented a case that was both legally airtight and morally devastating, documenting 20 years of systematic abuse enabled by institutional indifference. The verdict came on a gray Tuesday morning in March, guilty on all charges. Dishonorable discharge, stripped of rank and privileges, pension revoked, and a sentence of 5 years in military prison. The man who'd spent 3 decades building his legend watched it crumble in less than an hour of judicial pronouncement. The press storm that followed was intense but brief. Military sex scandals tend to burn hot and fade quickly, replaced by other outrages and newer controversies. But the institutional changes that followed were more significant and lasting: new reporting procedures, mandatory training, independent oversight committees, and most importantly, cultural shifts that made it harder for predators to operate with impunity. They offered me reinstatement with full honors, an official apology, and compensation for the damage to my career. I considered it for exactly 30 seconds before declining. The uniform that had once represented my highest aspirations now carried too much weight, too many memories, too much association with a system that had tried to destroy me for telling the truth. I didn't fight to wear the uniform again, I told the reinstatement board. I fought so it would mean something. That answer seemed to surprise them, as if they couldn't understand why someone wouldn't want to return to an institution that had betrayed them so completely. But I'd learned something important during those months of investigation and testimony. My identity wasn't tied to the uniform or the rank or the institution. It was tied to my principles, my integrity, my willingness to stand up for what was right even when it cost me everything. The other women who'd come forward were also offered reinstatement, and most of them accepted. Sarah Mitchell returned to active duty and was eventually promoted to captain. Jennifer Rodriguez completed her service and retired with full honors. Patricia Wells accepted a civilian position with the Department of Defense, using her experience to help reform the reporting systems that had failed her. Watching their careers recover and flourish provided a satisfaction that no personal vindication could have matched. These women had suffered in silence for years, believing their careers were over and their voices didn't matter. Seeing them reclaim their professional lives and find success despite everything they'd endured was the real victory. But success in fighting corruption comes with its own burdens. I became known in certain circles as the woman who brought down Admiral Thornton, a reputation that opened some doors while closing others. Some people saw me as a hero, others as a troublemaker, and still others as someone to be avoided for fear that association with me might bring unwanted scrutiny to their own institutions. The speaking invitations started arriving 6 months after the court-martial concluded. Military academies wanted me to address classes on ethics and leadership. Women's organizations wanted me to speak about standing up to harassment. Congressional committees wanted my input on military justice reform. Each invitation forced me to relive the experience, to open old wounds and examine old scars in public. But I accepted them because I'd learned that silence, while sometimes necessary for healing, could also enable the very problems it was meant to avoid. The most meaningful invitation came from the Naval Academy, asking me to speak to their senior ethics class about moral courage and institutional responsibility. Standing in that classroom, looking at faces that could have been my own 20 years earlier, I felt the weight of everything I'd learned about service, sacrifice, and the price of integrity. I wrote 3 words on the board: honor before obedience. A cadet in the front row raised her hand. "Ma'am, is that official Navy doctrine?" I smiled, remembering my own naive faith in official doctrine and institutional wisdom. "Not yet," I said. "But it should be." After the class, I stood by the harbor as the sun set over the water, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Ships moved in and out of port with a kind of precision that only comes from years of training and discipline. The sight still stirred something in me, still evoked the sense of pride and purpose that had first drawn me to military service. But it was a different kind of pride now, not the blind faith in institutional authority that I'd once carried, but a deeper understanding of what service really means. Service isn't about following orders without question or protecting the reputation of the organization above all else. Real service means holding the institution accountable to its own stated values, even when that accountability is painful and costly. The uniform I'd once worn with such reverence was hanging in my closet at home, cleaned and pressed, but no longer needed. Sometimes I'd look at it and remember the woman who'd first put it on, so eager to serve, so willing to trust, so unprepared for the reality of what that service might cost. That woman was gone, replaced by someone harder but wiser, someone who understood that justice isn't something institutions provide automatically, but something individuals must fight for continually. The pain of that transformation never fully disappeared, but it was balanced by the knowledge that my suffering had prevented others from enduring the same ordeal. Late at night, when the weight of memory became too heavy to bear, I'd play back the recordings one more time. Not Admiral Thornton's voice. I'd heard that enough to last several lifetimes, but the voices of the women who'd found the courage to speak after staying silent for so long. Their words carried a power that transcended their individual experiences, becoming something larger and more important than any single story of harassment or abuse. They were the sound of a system being forced to confront its own failures, the noise of walls coming down and secrets being exposed, the music of accountability finally arriving for those who thought themselves beyond its reach. Years later, I would receive letters from women I'd never met, military personnel who'd found the courage to report harassment because they knew they wouldn't face it alone, civilian employees who'd spoken up about discrimination because they'd seen that institutions could be forced to change, young people who'd chosen their own principles over institutional pressure because they'd learned that silence is not loyalty. Each letter was a small victory, a ripple effect from that moment when I'd chosen to preserve evidence rather than accept defeat. The impact wasn't always dramatic or immediately visible, but it was real and lasting, the kind of change that happens one person at a time, one decision at a time, one moment of courage at a time. The recording device that had captured Admiral Thornton's harassment was eventually returned to me as evidence no longer needed for prosecution. It was a simple digital recorder, nothing fancy or expensive, just a basic tool that happened to be in the right place at the right time to preserve truth. I kept it on my desk as a reminder of how small acts can have enormous consequences, how being prepared for the unexpected can mean the difference between justice and injustice, how technology can serve truth when human institutions fail to do so. But the most important lesson wasn't about recording devices or evidence preservation or legal strategy. The most important lesson was about the power of individual choice in the face of institutional pressure. Every day, people face moments when they must choose between personal comfort and moral courage, between self-preservation and standing up for what's right. The military had taught me many things: discipline, loyalty, attention to detail, the importance of following orders. But it hadn't taught me the most crucial lesson of all. That sometimes the highest form of loyalty is disobedience, that sometimes the greatest service is resistance, that sometimes protecting the institution means exposing its failures. Admiral Thornton had believed that his position made him untouchable, that his victims would never find their voices, that the system would protect him because he was part of that system. He was wrong on all counts, but his mistake was understandable. For 20 years, the system had protected him. For 20 years, his victims had stayed silent. For 20 years, his behavior had gone unchecked and unpunished. What changed wasn't the system. Institutions change slowly when they change at all. What changed was that one person decided to fight back, and that decision inspired others to do the same. The domino effect that followed wasn't planned or coordinated. It was the natural result of truth being given a voice and justice being demanded rather than requested. The final irony was that Admiral Thornton's downfall came not from any external enemy or foreign threat, but from the very people he was supposed to protect and lead. The women he'd victimized became the force that ended his career, proving that power built on abuse and intimidation is ultimately fragile and unsustainable. In the end, justice wasn't delivered by generals or admirals or congressional committees. It was delivered by ordinary people who found extraordinary courage, who chose to speak when silence would have been safer, who risked everything to ensure that truth would be heard above the noise of institutional self-protection. He thought a paycheck could buy my silence. He thought fear would buy my obedience. But what he never understood is that dignity doesn't negotiate. It doesn't compromise with corruption or make deals with abuse of power. Dignity stands its ground and demands accountability, even when that demand comes at enormous personal cost. The scar tissue from that battle will never completely heal. Some wounds are too deep, some betrayals too profound, some losses too significant to simply move past and forget. But scar tissue is stronger than the original skin, and the strength that comes from surviving institutional betrayal is different from any other kind of strength. It's the strength of knowing that you can stand alone when necessary, that you can trust your own judgment when everyone else is wrong, that you can endure isolation and attack and still emerge with your integrity intact. It's the strength that comes from discovering that your principles are more powerful than their pressure, that your truth is more durable than their lies, that your courage is more valuable than their approval. Justice isn't always loud, dramatic, or immediately visible. Sometimes it's quiet and persistent, working its way through systems that resist change, finding cracks in institutions that seem impenetrable, creating accountability where none existed before. Sometimes justice is just the sound of a powerful man's voice being played back to him in a room where he can't escape the truth of his own words. Sometimes it's the sight of a predator finally facing consequences for behavior he thought would remain hidden forever. Sometimes it's the knowledge that speaking up prevented others from suffering in silence. But most often, justice is the simple act of refusing to be silenced, of choosing truth over comfort, of standing up when it would be easier to stay down. It's the decision to preserve evidence when destruction would be simpler, to speak when silence would be safer, to fight when surrender would be more comfortable. The women who found their voices after years of silence didn't do so because they expected victory or demanded guarantees. They spoke because speaking was right, because truth deserved to be heard, because the next woman deserved better protection than they had received. Their courage wasn't the loud, dramatic kind that gets celebrated in movies or memorialized in speeches. It was the quiet, persistent kind that shows up every day, that refuses to be discouraged by setbacks or intimidated by retaliation, that keeps pushing forward even when the outcome remains uncertain. That's the kind of courage that changes institutions and transforms cultures. Not the courage of a single heroic moment, but the courage of sustained resistance to injustice, persistent demands for accountability, and unwavering commitment to principles that matter more than personal comfort. If you've ever been told to stay quiet, don't. If you've ever been pressured to accept unacceptable behavior, resist. If you've ever been told that speaking up will only hurt your own interests, remember that silence protects no one except those who benefit from injustice. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to remember that dignity doesn't whisper, it roars. Because honor doesn't compromise with corruption, truth doesn't negotiate with lies, and justice doesn't arrive automatically. It must be demanded, fought for, and earned through the courage of individuals who refuse to accept that wrong is right. The recording device is still on my desk, a simple piece of technology that helped topple a corrupt system. But the real power wasn't in the device, it was in the decision to use it, the choice to preserve truth, the commitment to justice regardless of personal cost. That power exists in every person who faces the choice between complicity and courage, between silence and speaking up, between accepting injustice and fighting for something better. The institution didn't give me that power, I had it all along. I just had to find the strength to use it. And in the end, that's what broke Admiral Thornton's hold over his victims and ended his career of predation. Not superior rank or better connections or institutional support, but the simple, devastating power of truth preserved and justice demanded by people who refuse to stay silent any longer. The echo of that recording still reverberates through the halls of power, a reminder that no position is high enough to escape accountability, no authority great enough to justify abuse, no institution powerful enough to silence truth indefinitely. Because honor doesn't whisper, it roars.